Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Authentic Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jill Simons, and I'm so excited to grow in the radical art of standing in what God says about you with you today. The show is a place where we pour into the sense of who God is, who we are, and how we can live more in the freedom that He has for us every single day. Hello, and welcome to the Authentic Uprising show. As always, I'm your host, Jill Simons, and I am so excited to be here with you today talking about something that I think is no stranger to any woman listening, which is worry. I feel like worry just feels like a part of what you're wired and required to do as a woman a lot of times. I see this pattern repeating in my daughter, who is only 7 years old, who she just worries about the people around her. And so this question of whether or not worry is a sin is something that I found so interesting to reflect on. And I've got an amazing guest here with me today to help answer this question. Her name is Lori Ann Wood, and she is an author of a book that just came out within the last week called Divine Detours. And she's going to be sharing with us about her walk with worry and how we can approach it more healthfully in our Christian life. Lori Ann, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
So why don't you share with us a little bit about what led you to write this book, Divine Detours, and how worry figures into the book as a whole?
Yes, I was really sidelined about, it's been about 7 years ago. I just thought I had the flu. I was just feeling kind of draggy and fatigued. And the long story short of that is I ended up spending 2 weeks in ICU and being suddenly diagnosed with heart failure. And it broadsided me because I had no family history. I had no risk factors. Nothing in my life would indicate a heart problem. And if I had ranked all of my worries at that point in my life, heart disease would have been at the very bottom of that list. And I didn't know what to do with that. It was something I had to really research. I didn't even know what it was. And it sort of sent me into this, not only this health crisis, but sort of a faith crisis as well. I started keeping a journal and asking a lot of questions to God, and I started worrying even more than I'm typically doing, which was a lot anyway. But there was a lot of concern surrounding that. And those months where nothing was happening and I wasn't getting any better and nothing that the doctors were doing was helping, I really felt a distance from God. And thankfully, I had a lot of prayer support and I was able to hang on to my faith. But those sort of dry months, I learned a lot of things. And one of the things I learned during that time is that I think any life answers 3 questions, but those questions beg to be answered when we get detoured, when we get off the course of our lives that we had planned and hoped for. And then we start to ask these questions. And so that became the basis of my writing. And after about 4 years of doing that, then I started writing this book, and it's finally coming out. And I'm just so thrilled to be able to share that and the experiences that I've had with everyone.
So tell us about what these questions are and how you came to them.
Yes. So the questions, what happened was as I mentioned, I started keeping this journal. When I was first in the hospital, one of my friends dropped a journal by. It was just like a little notebook. And I think she intended for me to write, things for I still had kids at home, and, what do I need for my kids? What do they need? And phone numbers and doctor's instructions. But what I found I was doing was in the middle of the night when I was there hooked up to all kinds of machinery in the hospital, I started just writing down some questions for God. Like, I don't understand. How did I end up here? What's going to happen next? I thought you were taking care of me. Where are we headed with this? And those questions, is sort of an angsty complaint journal more than anything else, became the basis for some articles that I wrote. And then they started just taking on kind of a life of their own. I started a blog. And then when I started after a few years of doing that, I stepped back from everything that I was writing to sort of look at what is this that I'm writing? I was writing what was coming to me, but I didn't know what it was. And once I stopped and looked at it as a whole, I realized that everything fell into 3 categories. Excuse me. And those 3 categories, I'm going to call them, were actually 3 big questions. And the more I dug into them, the more I realized they were the same 3 things Jesus struggled with when he went to the desert. In those 40 days after he first started his public ministry, and we call those temptations usually, but any temptation is really just an internal question that we're asking ourselves. And so those 3 questions that I was having, and all of the writing I was doing was sort of migrating into these 3 areas, were also the 3 questions that Jesus, in his most vulnerable, needy moment, was asking as well. And so I knew then that was something that I needed to pursue. And so that became the skeleton of this book. And those 3 questions, if you remember, when Jesus was in the desert, in the account in Matthew, the first temptation or the first exchange he has with Satan is Satan says, "Tell these stones to become bread." And that is the question that I call the question of worry, because what Jesus was asking in that time of his greatest need, he was more than hungry. He was asking, is this life all there is? Is there anything beyond this life? Or should I be concerned with what happens in this immediate day-to-day existence? Should I be worried about food and clothing and happiness and comfort? Because if this life is all there is, I should be worried about those temporal things. And if this life isn't all there is, then I have something bigger on my plate. And I started to dig into those and looked at questions about loss and uncertainty and regret and fear. And so that was the first question when he said, "Tell these stones to become bread." The second question is when Satan said, he said, I call it the question of doubt, but basically he said, "Throw yourself down off this cliff and I bet you won't even get hurt. I bet God's angels will protect you." And that question of doubt became something that was rolling through my head as well. And that question was, is God always good? Is he always good? Is he always on my side? Is he always protecting me? And in the book, I looked at ideas of protection and resilience and vulnerability and idols. And I learned a lot about what I considered good. How did I define God's goodness? And then the third question is a question of control. And that came from when Satan, the third time, came to Jesus and said, "If you'll bow down and worship me, all these kingdoms will be yours." And the question that formulated in Jesus's mind and in our mind as well is God's plan enough?
Yeah, absolutely. I love having those 3 as a framework. And I think tying them to Christ's temptation is so helpful because all of those things that we see Jesus walk through, not only the struggle that he's walking through, but also how he deals with them is so instructive to us because of course he answers the questions with scripture that he has hidden in his heart, ready to answer these questions that come up. And I think that that's a really helpful tactic in the conversation around worry as well, when we have very targeted memorized scriptures that help us to remember this is reality. Like we're bringing our perception into alignment with what is actually true, even when we're worrying it feels, either risky or just straight up untrue. And it feels like we have to do something to kind of grapple with the situation, as opposed to it's not a non-action, but it's a less busy action to like lay it down at the feet of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And, I love the way that it's written in, it's translated in the Message version when Jesus is on the Sermon on the Mount is talking about worry. And, we're just we're going to do that. Some of us are going to do that more than others. Some of us are wired to worry more than others, for sure. But in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus was talking about things like birds and wildflowers, and he wasn't scolding. He wasn't in a scolding tone. He was more in a comforting tone. What we can say there is that he really was treating us more like children, more than he was saying, you need to not do this in a scolding tone. And I love in the Message version, there's a line in there where the translation says, what I'm trying to do here is get you to relax. Because when we can relax, we can really give it to God and be so much more at ease than we would otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we talked briefly before we started recording about being mothers. Both of us are mothers, and I know so many of our listeners are mothers. And how often, it's sort of one thing to get to a point where you release worry about yourself, where you can let go of, what am I going to wear? What am I going to eat? And that's sort of one level that we can get to. But a lot of times, parenthood will sort of strip that level away from us. There's a lot less worry about ourselves, that just practically there's time for less of that. But once we have our kids going around in the world, there's this whole new area of worry that opens up, which is how do we really trust God with other people? And a lot of times it can be seen as sort of a badge of honor or kind of symptom of how much a mom cares, how much they worry. And so what would you speak into that, especially for moms that are navigating kids out of the house for the first time and things like that, maybe first time at school, first time at college, and figuring out what the balance is of caring authentically about your children, but also not falling into worry that leads us to distrust of God?
That's such a good question. Because I think, like you were talking about, there's a fine line between being what we call a worrier and being someone who's a planner or being an intentional mom. And what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount and what he demonstrated to us when he was in the desert struggling with his own question of worry is that he's not saying don't worry. He's saying you don't have to worry. I've got this. I'm drawing you closer into my heart, and you don't have to worry. But, as moms, what we do is we're sort of hardwired to try to hold that baby chick and protect them. And they'll always be that baby chick. So what we have to do, and what I've found that's helpful, and it almost gets a little bit easier once they are outside of your physical control. When they're inside your physical control, I found it harder to have that balance of letting them go, but still being so involved in their day-to-day life. But when they're gone from home, you get this sense that you're not in control and they're making these decisions. And when I was in that with my children, there was just this realization that I got from God that said, you know what? I love them even more than you do. You love them and you're a great mom and you would do anything for them, but I love them even more than that. And the other thing I think that I keep coming back to, because when we let them go, and part of the worry is that they'll make this mistake and it will ruin their life and they'll never get it back, is that God was the one that set up the idea of free will. He put that in place for us so that our love for him would be a real choice. It would be real. It wouldn't be, I'm going to love you so I get something back. It was a real love. And it was God's bargain. So when we give our children that same free will, that's all we can do. That's all we can expect. And so he knows the risk and the rewards of free will. And he also loves them so much more than we do, and has even a plan for them that we couldn't comprehend now. So as much as we want for our children, he wants even more. And those are the ways that I started changing my prayers. Instead of, specifically, I want A, B, and C for my child, and I want them to decide A, B, and C. It was more along the lines of that.
Yeah, that is a really beautiful shift, because I think that is something that also helps us remember sort of our proper space and our proper role in the whole spectrum of their lives, really. And that's something that I try and think about. Now all my children are small, and I'm kind of at the stage of like school for the first time, and that, like, there's 8 hours of the day that I'm not seeing them. And it's funny because I have struggled with that a lot less than I expected to. And I think I laid a good foundation for that, where even when they were small, even from the age of my 6-month-old, I try and think about them as being really just sort of temporarily in my care. And we are actually like both children of God that are really at kind of the same part of the family. Like, we're both under God primarily. And I have this responsibility to them for this section of their lives that I take very seriously and love very much. But it also is something that I see as being like a discrete portion of my life and a discrete portion of their lives, where I don't try and enter into it with like, this is going to be under my control for a long time. Because there's nothing like having kids to make you realize how little you do control.
Yes, it's so true. And I think one of the things that I realized too is that faith, whether we're talking about children or we're talking about health or we're talking about our career or finances or family, faith doesn't dispel our worries. It doesn't take away our worries. And we shouldn't feel bad if we still have those worries, because what those worries can do, rather than tear down our faith, is they can actually cause us to take that worried heart to God. They're a calling inside us that says, I need something bigger than myself. I have this worry because I can't carry this on my own. And so that gives us this realization that there's someone bigger and stronger and that can see the entire picture. We need that in our lives. And so worry can be a blessing, but can also be something that can drive us away from God if we tend to focus on that, and we focus only on this life and only on what's happening here. And that's what Satan was trying to get Jesus to do in the desert, was focus, put your eyes down, focus down here on what's happening here. And that's what he will do to us with worry, is he will try to force our focus down instead of up. And so that is where we have to be careful about worry. It can drive us into God's arms, but it can also cause us to cast our vision too low.
That is so insightful, because I think that there's a tendency sometimes to feel um, maybe, like less than or flawed in some way if you're a person who is prone to worry. But I love how you said that if it's something that's drawing us into deeper relationship with God, then there's always that positive. I've told stories when I've spoken lots of times about, just kind of disasters that we've had as a family, something where everything went wrong, but when it was something that we walked through and processed through together as a family, it was actually something that kind of knit us closer together. And I think that there's that potential with anything that we take to God. And so that's a really helpful framework to enter into it when we are dealing with maybe extended worries or a pattern of worry in our lives, and remembering that it really is a grace to turn us back to the Savior.
Yes, and something you said earlier reminded me of something I had heard about before, but had not really had any experience with, was the prayer of relinquishment. When sometimes as moms, or or in any area of our life, we get a hold of a prayer request, and I'm guilty of this. It's sort of a pit bull approach. We grab a hold of it and we're not going to let go until we get the thing we want from God. And he wants to hear from us, and he wants us to be persistent. But sometimes we get to a point where our vision of how we want it to be resolved becomes the object of our prayer instead of God, instead of someone's well-being. And sometimes we have to let go of that in light of God's greater planned good. And when we can get to that point and say, these are my concerns, this is how I see it, but what I want, like Jesus said in Gethsemane, not my will, but your will is what I want in this situation. And that's when we really can lay our worry aside, when we can relinquish what we see as the perfect plan, what we see as the route we want to take, and give it back to God.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. So you started on this path with your kind of health disruption. This came into your life. And as you were sharing with me before we jumped on, that there was, signs that had been missed and things like that. And if you would like to share some of those, we'd love to hear that. But I'm also interested in your take on sort of the balance of, being aware of these things and things that can be, moral risk factors in our children, health risk factors in ourselves and our spouse, just kind of nurturing awareness while having that not be something that leads us into just an ever deepening cycle of worry.
Yes, let me talk about that first. I think one of the things that helps us when we're prone to worry, or when we're in a season of worry, is that know what your limits are as a mom, as a person, a human being, in your health knowledge, whatever it is. Know when that's all you can do, and you need to reach out to someone else. And whether that's with your children and you need to reach out to God, you need to reach out to counselors, you need to reach out to mentors, or in your health journey, if there's something going on with you and you're searching on the internet, or you're asking friends or whatever, there becomes a limit to what you can figure out on your own. And that's when you need to go see doctors and you need to get different opinions. And so that's a key thing. Is I think sometimes as moms, we're sort of do-it-yourselfers, and we like to get to the root of the problem on our own. But we need to know when we're at the limit for what we can handle, and then get to that higher knowledge level that we need. And, that happened to me with this heart failure stuff. I had symptoms for, I can look back now and see, for years and years and years. Um, it seemed like it broadsided me. It seemed like I had no idea I was going to have heart failure. And then there it was. But there were some little sneaky symptoms that I ignored. My family would say, Mom, something's not quite right here. And I'd say, oh, I'm getting older. I'm not in good shape.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that is something that happens for a lot of women, especially as moms, when we put ourselves last.
Yes, we just do that because that's kind of what we think we need to do. But some of the things that happened to me, and if I had known that looking at these as a set was a red flag, I probably would have done something about it. But I sort of excused them all for different reasons. But there were things like inability to exercise. I had a really hard time with any kind of incline, whether it was a staircase or a hill, anything like that was really tricky for me. I had a rapid heart rate at certain times, and I just thought, I'm a nervous kind of person, and it just would beat really fast. An unusual amount of fatigue, and just a shortness of breath overall, which I don't even think I knew what that meant at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things, and I love what you said about really knowing what our limits are. It reminds me of, different situation entirely, but at the beginning of the pandemic, I was 9 months pregnant, getting ready to have a baby, right? Heading into the pandemic. And there was one night where I was just like, I don't think I can read the news anymore. Like, I think that this is something that it is okay to walk away from this because this is not doing good things for me. This is not doing good things for my unborn child. I cannot impact what is happening. This is not a situation that God is calling me to like change in the world. And it's okay to lay that down and walk away.
Yes, yes. And I think it's also important to listen to your friends, and your family, the people that are the closest to you, because like I mentioned, my family was saying, Mom, you should be able to climb that set of stairs like the other parents do. And I would be like, my husband ran marathons, my kids were in high school sports. I'm the odd one out because I'm not in the shape that they're in. And I needed to be able to get a different perspective. And sometimes that's your friends, sometimes it's your family. But I think the big takeaway there is don't wait for a problem to become something bigger. And if we have that mechanism in place where we say, I have other eyes on this situation, whether it's with our children or with our health or with our faith, then it takes away some of our worry because it's not all on us anymore. We have someone partnering with us to help carry that burden. And so that extra level of, oversight can really help bring your worry level down and your stress level down and be a big comfort in all areas of your life.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Lori-Ann, for being here with me today. It's been so wonderful. We're going to have a link to Lori-Ann's book and where you can connect with her elsewhere online, both in the YouTube description and in our show notes, so you can connect with her. And I hope that you all have the best rest of your day. Lori-Ann, thank you so much for being here with me.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Authentic Uprising podcast. It is always a joy to be with you. I encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, whichever place you most prefer, or do it all if that is what floats your boat. We would love to continue to get to know you better and grow in relationship with you. And so I encourage you to check out the links in both our show notes and our YouTube description that tell you more about where you can connect with us elsewhere. The two big things we have going on besides the podcast is our shop that is full of reminders of who you are in God, helping you to really grow in that radical art of standing in who you are and giving gifts that help others to do the same. The other big thing we have going on is the Uprising Academy. This is all of our formation programs, workshops, retreats. Everything is available virtually and on demand, where you can sign up and continue to learn more about radically standing in what God says about you, especially if you are in a place in your life where you are not being fed the way that you long to be fed. Whether it's in your community, whether it's at your church, whatever it is, there is more for you, and we can absolutely walk with you into it through the Uprising Academy. All those links are in our show notes, and if you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to leave a review. Reviews are the number one way that we help get in front of new faces, new people that are able to be touched by the radical art of standing in what God says about us. I love you. I'm praying for you. I hope you have an amazing week.